But what I also really like about the way that we're starting to think about consent and implementing ideas around consent is that, you know, it can be withdrawn at any time. We're starting to think much more seriously about how power dynamics affect sexual relationships, and intimate relationships and romantic relationships, so that yeses are not always yeses in the way that we would understand enthusiasm. We have something in South Africa called Tutuzela care centers.
Yes.
And they are basically one-stop sexual assault, sexual violence, gender-based violence units within certain public hospitals within the country.
Yeah.
Perpetrators are people. GBV survivors are also people, which makes them complicated. They're not angelic victims. It's one of the most damaging stereotypes because it says that some people deserve violence and other people don't because of who they are.
Yeah.
And nobody's perfect.
Yeah.
Because I think there's also this really toxic narrative around if you've been raped, your life is over now.
Yeah.
You'll never be the same again. So to tell survivors that there's no right way to recover.
Yeah.
That you need to find the thing for you and go from there.
Yeah.
I do think counselling is helpful, even if it's to talk about how it's affected you and not what happened. I think I'll always volunteer at Rape Crisis because it's definitely an amazing organization. And the latest project that Kwanele is looking at now is it's building a chatbot, essentially using generative AI, artificial intelligence.
Yes.
But I think what is always helpful is to sort of celebrate the wins, the little wins with yourself, but also to, know that post-traumatic growth is a beautiful thing.
Hello and welcome to Navigating the 20s. You are with me, Zinhle Novazi. In today's episode, I engage in a powerful dialogue with Ronel Koekemoer, a survivor-centered gender-based violence specialist and business development manager at Kwanele South Africa. Drawing from her experience as a sexual trauma counselor at Rape Crisis Cape Town Trust, Ronel shares insights on the forefront of the battle against gender-based violence. We explore the nuances of consent and the significance of non-judgmental support for survivors. In this episode, you will discover Kwanele's groundbreaking work in the GBV space, utilizing technology to provide women with a fast, accessible, data-free mobile app for help and guidance through the challenging processes of laying charges and securing convictions. So tune in for inspiring conversations on consent, survivor support, and innovative solutions combating gender-based violence.
So Ronel, how are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. I mean, for some of our listeners that have not come into contact with your profile on LinkedIn or just in general socially, who is Ronel? And like, if your friends or your mom had to describe you, how would they describe you?
Wow.
Or even your partner. Let me say even your partner. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know how they would describe me, but I think a big part of my sort of personality or my lifeblood is working in sexual and gender-based violence. And that's what I talk about all the time. And I'm sort of not fun at parties because
it's a big topic.
And I think people would describe, they'd know that about me. Like I'm definitely the person that, if somebody does need help, they'll be like, Ronel will know.
Yeah.
Fun.
I agree with you. I think based on our conversation earlier, I could definitely co-sign on that.
Thank you.
But speaking of like the fact that you're so passionate about the GBV space, like what led you to want to start a career in that space, and what particularly do you feel your role or your calling in that space is?
Sure. So, I mean, it didn't start out that way. I think I was very fortunate to go to I had a really positive schooling experience at an all-girls school, which I know a lot of people don't have.
Yeah.
But for me, it was a really cool space because I grew up in an environment where like the best sports person was a girl.
Exactly.
The best academic person was a girl, you know, and so I was always surrounded by like women and girl power and like, girls the positive female friendships and things like that.
Yeah.
And when you're in those spaces, obviously, as you go through them and you get older and older, then, you know, girls, you get boyfriends, or girls get teachers hit on girls, or, you know, and and I think it's also something you're always taught to worry about is, you know, rape or gender-based violence.
Yeah.
And it was always something that like really frustrated me, that was such an inevitable part of growing up.
Yeah.
And I think when I got to varsity and, you know, was around, and I don't have brothers, so I've never grown up around
males.
men.
Yeah.
It was such a shock for me that like some of these things were like new to people.
Yeah.
But I wasn't going to go into gender-based violence.
Yeah.
I think my aspirations was to be a history teacher.
Really?
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah. And then like in my second, third year.
Yeah.
I was doing psychology, and then I saw an advert for Volunteers for Rape Crisis.
Yes.
But it had always, like, sexual violence is personally very, very relevant to me and very important to me. And then I was like, okay, I'll see what that's like.
Yeah.
And then they called me, and then I did the training course, and it changed my life.
Wow.
So, and
what was the training course on?
So it was to become a volunteer counsellor in rape crisis. So all of their counsellors are volunteers.
Yes.
And it's an amazing service, and it's free, and it's, you know, and it's very intensive training. So it's you get screened a lot. So you really have to be okay with your own stuff, because you can't bring it to other people.
Exactly.
You know, and then there was an opportunity to become staff, and I applied, and then I realized that this is what this is what I want. I want to do this every day.
Yeah.
Like I do.
So it's kind of like it gravitated towards you more than you were actively pursuing that path.
Like I think I almost saw it as like it was going to be like my volunteering in the back of my life. But then now it's become my whole world. Yeah.
Yeah. And talk to me through a few things, like people who don't understand what gender-based violence is, if you can break it down for me.
Sure.
Into simpler terms, and where does like intimate partner violence fit into GBV? Is it all the same thing?
Sure. Yeah. So, and I mean, I think that's an important question, because and I do think GBV is such a buzzword right now as well. And I'm glad, you know, love that, because it's good that that's becoming so much more of a conversation. But gender-based violence is sort of your broad category, and it's basically different types of forms of violence directed towards people because of their gender and their gender identity. Yeah. So they're also particularly vulnerable to victimization because of their gender identity. So, you know, and it's not, and I think people often think it's just women and girls, but it's not. It can also be, you know, people who are on the gender spectrum, but also like children, like boy children, men who are inappropriately masculine, in inverted commas, and you know, and that sort of thing as well. So, but it's this idea of like their gender is the primary reason for victimization. Yeah. And intimate partner violence and domestic violence fall within that as well, often because you're particularly vulnerable to a certain kind of violence because of your gender identity and your proximity to another gender identity, which is often masculine, you know, hyper masculinity and toxic masculinity. But domestic violence and is violence within like a home setting, but not necessarily just a home, like a family setting as well. So
this is with people you actually know.
Yes. So it wouldn't necessarily be like you and I. It would be someone within your family system, and it could be, you know, violence perpetrated against like an elder in your family or a young child in your family or your spouse or your partner. And so intimate partner violence can also then be an offshoot of that. But intimate partner violence is between romantic partners. Okay. So there's a distinction there as well. Yeah.
Yeah. That's actually a really good breakdown, which kind of like will lead to the conversation of consent, which, I mean, you mentioned girls' schools, which I also think, if I go back, I went to girls' school too.
Oh, really?
We should start teaching consent in Allo. I think it teaches sex or sexual education, sex education in the wrong format. But I've often heard people say things like, in South Africa, it's hard to understand if women want sex or not. If somebody says, I'm not in the mood, does that mean they're in the mood later, or are they directly saying yes or no? So what is consent? And if I'm in a relationship with someone, do I always have access to sex? Is sex always guaranteed?
Yeah, no. Yeah. It's the short answer. No, it's not. No, and look, I think, and it is relatively new, that idea of consent and the conception that we have of consent as well, because, you know, under the apartheid laws, marital rape was legal. So it was definitely this idea of like, if you're in a relationship with somebody, that you have that access. But that's thank goodness changed.
Yeah.
But consent is also not like the yes or no of it all. It's a lot about, and I really like that definition about, it's like consent is like fries, and then it's freely given, reversible. But it's really great because it's a much more positive conception of consent, where it's sort of saying that like consent is specific to different sexual acts, different kinds of intimacy. But it's also something that's exciting and something you want and is enthusiastic.
Yes.
And that's sort of, you know, also very key. But what I also really like about the way that we're starting to think about consent and implementing ideas around consent is that, you know, it can be withdrawn at any time.
Exactly.
The other thing that what I'm really enjoying about the conversation around consent is we're starting to think much more seriously about how power dynamics affect sexual relationships and intimate relationships and romantic relationships, so that yeses are not always yeses in the way that we would understand enthusiasm.
Exactly.
And I think that that's really important as well. So we're starting to see that, like, yes, people can consent to things, but does it take power dynamics into account? And I really like that that's where the conversation seems to be. It's a lot like the Me Too movement did.
Exactly. And even with Kwezi, because that was the whole conversation of, is wearing something implicitly saying that, yes, I consent. And because, you know, of the relationship between Kwezi and Jacob Zuma, there was obviously that power dynamic. And she also felt that she could not say no, because, I mean, this was somebody who was elderly and respectable in the family.
100%.
Yeah.
And I think like that's a really important facet of the conversation, because I've had so many clients who don't meet that definition, where they didn't say no, but that's not the point, because they did not want to, and they maybe didn't fight back, but it was definitely they were afraid, they were scared of the repercussions, they were fearful for their lives. And like, you know, it's important that we are at a place now where we can acknowledge that constitutes sexual violence, like, you know, without a shadow of a doubt.
And even when I actually think of it, like, often I have conversations with my girlfriends who are like on Tinder, or just random women. And a lot of them also say there's also this perception in the Tinder Bumble culture that if a guy pays on a date, then it's guaranteed sex afterwards without consent. And sometimes certain women will feel a guilt and feel like they have to go. Or if you find yourself going on a date and meeting at the guy's place, and you don't know how to say no, am I going to be able to walk away from that situation? What advice do you have? Like, it's actually a tricky one to say, because it's almost like we're putting the pressure on women to kind of find a solution to that, when it should be, let's educate men to do better.
Yeah, I mean, and it is tricky because you always, and especially I think working with communities and especially like the diversity within South Africa, and like in terms of cultural beliefs, religious backgrounds, like, you know, the racial stuff, the economic stuff. There's also like, you can't be saying there's a one size fits all model. And we see that a lot, where you can't say, you must just say no. You know, you must just ignore. If he catcalls you, you must educate him. It's dangerous to do that if you're a certain kind of person. And like, I think, and again, it's power, you know, and power dynamics, and, you know, and I think that, but what I would say in terms of that is to be able to, I think to let women and to teach women to be much more proactive and assertive in conversations around sex. And to sort of like bring it up on the first date and manage expectations. I mean, like, if that's what's going on here, then either you're going to be disappointed, or like we're on the same page about this. Because I think that that's important, is that women can feel that they can put that out there, and then it's up to the other person to make their decisions. But instead of them sort of feeling like I'm just going to hope he's a nice guy.
Yes.
But I hate that as well because it is also like
there's a perception. And what is a nice guy?
No, often not that nice.
Yeah.
But also, again, it's and I mean, that's the frustration about this conversation about gender, but sexual violence especially is like, it's always women who have to adjust their behavior.
Exactly.
And it sucks, man. Like it really, and it's not always helpful because even if you do manage the best of expectations.
Exactly. It doesn't guarantee that nothing's going to happen.
Yeah.
And it's so sad. Like we are living in a world where we have to be proactive. Like I'm also like, where I'm like, no, men need to take accountability. I'm often switching and then I'm like, but no, I need to know how to protect myself in certain situations. I need to inform myself as much as possible. And like, I guess an uncomfortable conversation to have that I also realized when I underwent training is like, I don't know, most women also don't know what do you do if an incident happens and you find yourself in a situation where you're basically, somebody has violated you sexually or in any other manner. And obviously there's like a court system that we have to go and there's evidence and all of that. So like if I've been a victim of a sexual assault, let's say I went on a Tinder date and something happens, what's the first thing that I need to do?
Sure. So, and I do love being asked this question because there's an amazing model in South Africa that a lot of people don't know about.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have known about it if I didn't work in this sector.
Yeah.
But we have something in South Africa called Tutuzela care centers.
Yes.
And they are basically one-stop sexual assault, sexual violence, gender-based violence units within certain public hospitals within the country.
Yeah.
And it's a great service in theory and often in implementation as well, but in theory because it's like you start there and then whatever resources need to be mobilized can be mobilized. So if a social worker needs to be, if it's a child and a social worker needs to be called, they'll call the social worker.
Yeah.
If you want to open a case with the police, then the inspecting officer will be called to come take your statement. But it's also where people will have access then to the medical side of things, like health checkups and stuff like that, and the morning after pill if that's necessary, and your post-exposure prophylaxis for HIV prevention.
Yeah.
But it's also the forensic level where they will do the rape kits.
Yes.
You know? And then also, which I'm biased towards, but crucially, there's also a counsellor there. And so they're able to contain you and talk you through the process and, sort of make that space much more sensitized.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people think you have to go to SAPS and like stand in the line.
Which can also have its own problems.
No, it's horrible.
SAPS is not always equipped.
No, and the people that within the police that manage sexual violence, something we call them the FCS unit. It's the Family Violence, Child Protection and Sexual Offences unit.
Yes.
And they are, in theory, specialized to deal specifically with those kinds of crimes. So they're also sensitized and they're trained and they know the Sexual Offences Act and the Child Protection Act and all of those things.
Yeah.
So it's not your average guy at the charge office who is also signing, certifying your documents. That's the one who's supposed to be taking your statement because that statement is so important.
Exactly.
So I think a lot of people don't realize that. And I think a lot of people don't report because they think they have to go to SAPS and they don't trust
exactly.
SAPS. So I think if more people knew about the TCC, so the Tutuzela Care Center, we call the TCC model, I think people would be a little bit less hesitant. And also that there's no, we say, prescription on sexual offences, on rape in South Africa. So you can report 40 years later.
Yeah.
And the TCC is great there because, you can have forensic evidence done and still decide, I'm not going to report right now.
Yeah. And they'll still keep that evidence.
And they will keep that evidence. I'm not 100% sure how long they keep it for, but they do keep it for quite a while.
Yeah.
But it's so that is your first thing is to try and get to the TCC as soon as possible, and not necessarily to report because you don't have to report to have access to that service.
Yeah.
But to get that medical assistance is like so crucial.
Yeah.
Because a lot of that medication has like a 48-hour or 72-hour window.
Yeah.
So you've got to get that as quickly as possible.
Makes sense. So the TCCs, the Tutuzela Care Centers, are all over the country, right? In each and every province. And how, like, if I needed to call one, do I go to a website? Is there a hotline?
Sure.
How does it work?
Yeah, so they're not at every public hospital.
Yeah.
unfortunate thing is that they are very concentrated in urban areas, which is often the case, but they are accessible. I know Rape Crisis recently did a map of all the TCCs in each different province and their contact numbers.
Yes.
But so what I would do is look for that Tutuzela Care Centre, Gauteng, Mpumalanga, Western Cape, and go from there, and then it should come up. But also to see, because they're housed within specific hospitals. So in like the Western Cape, there's one in Karlbremer Hospital, there's one in Victoria Hospital, there's one in Heideveld, and Khayelitsha District Hospital as well.
Yeah.
So what I would do, what I used to do when I was still working at Rape Crisis is you can call the hospital directly and ask to be put through to the Tutuzela
so that you don't have to go through the admin stuff in the hospital. Yeah,
because a lot of people will walk into trauma, for example, and then wait and then be made to wait. And, and it's a very specialized service, but they also are now starting to see domestic violence cases as well. So it's not just sexual violence.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay, so we'll definitely put up like notes on TCC so that people know where to go. The other part that I want to kind of ask, do you think, or in what ways do you think as South Africans or as family members, as friends of GBV survivors, how are we failing them, or how are we failing to show up for them?
So many ways.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most crucial ones is to not be survivor-led, right? And I think, I see that a lot in counseling where I think we all want to fix and we all want to make it better, and we don't have control and we want control. So we start mobilizing and we need to report, we need to do this, we need to do that. And we don't just listen and sit with the person's emotions.
Yes.
And listen to what they think the best way forward is, or what they're feeling that they have capacity for.
Yeah. And sure, that's such an important point, because at the end of the day, the survivor knows best, better than they know the full situation. 100%. They know when they're at the highest risk. So you coming in objectively is not always necessarily the right answer.
No, and I mean, exactly. And especially, considering that there's also this victim offender dynamic in South Africa. And I think in a lot of contexts, where a lot of survivors know their perpetrator. And it's much more complicated than like getting the man who dragged you into a bush to go to prison forever.
Exactly.
It's way more complicated than that. And I think, and you see it a lot with like partners or best friends or parents where they're like, we have to report and we have to, we have to go through the court process. And that's not every survivor's journey, and I think to respect that is very important, because it's also important not to infantilize rape survivors and treat them like they're now incapacitated and destroyed, and
because then you're taking the control away again, which is like another trauma from
but it's hard, and I mean that's why I sometimes used to say like counseling feels sometimes like a bit of a gimmick, or like a cheap trick, just because like all I do is like really just listen and sit with those really uncomfortable, horrible emotions. And like, when you put it that way, it doesn't sound very difficult, but it's hard, and I think it's so rare how many people get a platform like that and get access to a platform like that, where someone's just going to sit with you in that.
They're not going to tell you what to do, how to do, when to do, but just listen.
Absolutely. So I think that's a big way we're failing survivors. But also I think to let the sort of stereotypes and myths win. We still do that as well. And victim blame.
Yes.
And I think it's so ingrained in us as a society. I mean, even the way media articles are structured.
Exactly.
And it's very,
it's always focused on the woman as if she's actually the perpetrator of her own violence.
And there's some kind of behavior that she did or they did to sort of warrant this. And I think there's also this in South Africa, this thing of like, well, South Africa is a dangerous place.
That's the thing. It doesn't make it acceptable.
What did you think was going to happen? And I think like we don't check that enough at the door. And like I think it's okay to have those feelings, because I think a lot of that is quite intuitive now, but to just be very aware of that and like work on that, especially because what I think as well happens a lot is that I almost want to say I guarantee that everybody knows a sexual violence survivor. You just don't know. You know one.
Exactly.
And a lot of the time when we have these conversations, you're communicating to that person whether or not you're safe to talk to.
Yeah.
And I think to sort of go in assuming that you've got to be sensitive to people in general.
Yeah.
And be aware of what the possible trigger points there might be.
Yeah.
And I think we don't have enough of those conversations because there is still this perception of sexual violence as like a thing that happens in like isolated context.
And it's not. It's happening right here. It's happening right now in our spaces.
Yeah. And, the perpetrators are not scary black strange men. Like they're private school swimmers.
Exactly.
Like, they
Some
are
of them are teachers. They're in our trusted spaces, communities.
Yeah. And I think to sort of be aware of those dynamics is very, very important.
Yeah. When you speak about like trigger sensitivity and all of that, like we live in an era where everyone's putting everything out on social media. How do you, if you want to speak out about an incident, how do you do that in a way that is like trigger sensitive, or like you give people trigger warnings before you're about to communicate something that might possibly trigger someone?
Yeah. And that's such a great question, because I think we have to walk that balance between like not avoiding the conversation because we don't upset people, but also like letting survivors feel that they can go and not be reminded that they're a rape survivor constantly, which I think the media can sometimes do.
Yeah.
But I think, to try and be as trauma informed as possible is always the go-to, and to seek consent, right? Like,
yes,
it's something I do in my personal life, and I get, my mom looks at me funny sometimes where I'm like, can I give you a hug, or can I, like, I always ask. And it's a little bit like, it's because we weren't taught that. It's like, you kiss auntie so and so,
exactly.
Rather ask permission, right? It's not, and it's actually it's quite. The more we do that, the more we normalize it. But I think to also to be able to like give people as much information so that they can decide what to engage with. So content notes, trigger warnings.
Yes. Yeah.
So to say to somebody like this is going to come up.
Yeah.
And not to sort of surprise people about it.
Which I think also we need to create spaces, because now men or like people in other groups don't feel comfortable enough to be like, there's a space that exists for me to also be, or like, I don't even know, like they aren't, I think because of the narrative around it, and again, I think in South Africa, within our context, majority is women. So there's also like an emasculating sort of feel to men coming up to the forefront to be like, but I'm also a survivor.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, and I think especially, the prevalence amongst boys is, and we also have a huge problem in South Africa, and it's also a conversation I don't think people are ready to have around incest.
Yes.
And that's a huge problem, and especially against young boys.
Yeah.
And I think, child on child sexual violence is also a big thing, and that happens in those contexts as well.
Yeah.
But also, within the LGBTIQ plus community, and there's and especially like grinder culture, very toxic, and that thing about like Tinder, like it's kind of an expectation that you're on Grindr. But then also, I think with female perpetrators, women perpetrators. There's a tendency not to take that very seriously because, how does that work?
Exactly.
People get very caught up in the logistics of that.
Yeah.
But it does happen.
Yeah.
Where there's people, I think violence will happen. And I think to be sensitive to that as well. And it needs to be a conversation in all spaces, I think.
Absolutely. And if I could ask you, how do I show up to a survivor with no judgment? So if, for instance, if a little boy or a man or somebody who's not typically, or who I would not typically think fits the survivor model, comes to me and tells me that this is the situation, how do I not come up with judgment and be like, oh, but are you sure?
It's tricky. And I don't, I think counselors we can sometimes pretend we're so good at that, but it's, judgments are also just the ways that people organize the world. So it's not inherently negative.
Yeah.
But I think it's to be very conscious of your trigger points and like the things that you're going to now start making assumptions around. That's really important as well. And I think what does tend to happen a lot with survivors is judgments around if it's within like a romantic relationship or if the perpetrator is popular or a nice guy or all of those good things.
Or they're like a leader in the community or well respected.
Pastors, religious leaders. And but I think the easiest way for me is there's this wonderful concept in psychology called unconditional positive regard. Okay. Which is very basically like you believe what your client gives you in a like you give them the benefit of the doubt basically. And I really like that concept because that's what you do. Yeah. And you go in sort of even when things are like, I wonder how that like you sort of are like gonna trust that they're telling me the truth. And the way I like to explain it as well is like it's because you're not a judge or magistrate or a lawyer or the police or anybody. Yeah. So it isn't really your job to assess whether or not the person is telling the truth. Yeah. And that will come if it needs to. Because there's also this new, incel thing and this like moral panic within these really toxic masculine spaces about women reporting rape falsely.
Yes, that's yes. Like and that gets amplified all the time.
And I mean, the stat that I know, but I think it's quite outdated. I think it's from 2012, and I think the number's even lower now, is that there's an 8.6% conviction rate for rape in South Africa.
My gosh, that is scary.
So from the cases reported to the conviction stage, so there's a lot of drop-off throughout. 8.6% get a conviction, right?
My word.
So if you've been falsely accused... a lot has to happen
before you can get convicted. Before
you're going to Pollsmoor. Do you know what I mean? Like it's and I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm sure it does. But like that's not really where the moral panic should be.
Exactly. And what woman wants to put themselves through that level of scrutiny?
Absolutely. No, and I think and the burden of proof in sexual offences cases is incredibly high. So it's not an easy thing to get convicted of, right? It's not like the judge takes one look at you and it's like, you look like, that's how that works. Yeah. Not at all. It's much more complicated than that. So I think that to sort of go in knowing that there's a very low chance that this person is lying. Yeah. And I think to just check yourself on that as well. Yeah. But also, like I said, to trust that that person is confiding or disclosing in you for a reason. Yeah. And that, you need to meet them there and you need to watch yourself then and just be very reflective, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. When you say that, like even with me, I think through time I've had to relearn and unlearn, and then you realize, okay, this is not how I should have showed up, and your immediate like for me as somebody who likes problem solving, my immediate go-to is like, how can we solve this? So then I learned how that takes control away from somebody who's a GBV survivor, because already in their context, they don't feel like they have control, so now to have somebody else tell them. So I think your point around like you need to actually remove yourself from the situation and open the space and just listen. It's not about you in that moment.
And trust that like what I like to remind myself, and it's hard because I'm such a fixer. Like, if you tell me, oh, you're not feeling well, I've already got 5 different solutions for you that you don't. But how I like to think about it is like, I've been through a lot in my life and it wasn't nice and it's hard, but I was okay in the end and I did get through. Yeah. And like, other people will also get through and they will also, they're also capable like you're capable. So don't take that away from them and think, and don't take that autonomy and that agency away by thinking that you're the capable person in the room. Yeah. And my partner actually really helped with one case that was really difficult for me, where they said that like, just think of that survivor on their good day, like when they're laughing, and keep that in mind, because when people come to you, you're seeing the worst, right? And it's hard to then imagine that there's ever a good day. Yeah. But there are. So I think to do that with the people in your life as well, and remember that like just like you're capable, they're also capable. Exactly. And they're the expert in their own life. Yeah. And that's really, really important, I think, to keep in mind.
And when you speak about they're the expert in their own life, like our immediate gut instinct is to say, if somebody comes to me and they're GBV survivor, I've got to make sure they leave, and the goal is to get them to leave. And if they don't, like many people, like communities, friends will say, well, no, I'm not going to talk to you until you leave that person. Or how many times did I tell you not to go back?
Yeah.
And why is that problematic?
It's not helpful because that's what abusers thrive on is isolation. And the more that the support network, and that's one of the first things you do as well with survivors is you try to mobilize their support network as much as possible. So like the more isolated the person becomes, the more they're going to stay with an abusive partner. So it actually has the opposite effect a lot of the time because they've got nobody to turn to.
Yeah.
And except for this person who on some days is great and is always sorry and, you know, will never do it again.
Yeah.
And then you as the friends and the family become villainized a little bit because you're now punishing them for something that they're actually not doing.
Yeah.
And I think it's problematic to think that we can, you know, that we can force somebody to make a decision like that because it is so much more complicated. Like, especially with intimate partner violence and domestic violence, because there's a lot of socioeconomic stuff tied up in that, cultural stuff tied up in that, and you can't now come in and say, well, because how are you going to problem solve around like that person's circumstances?
Exactly.
Right? Because what if the abuser is the primary breadwinner in the family? What if they live in the same house?
Yeah.
And now the protection order you want to be served. Yeah. Where are people going? You know, are they coming to your house? And I think people are very quick to sort of punish survivor. I mean, if anything, rather don't talk to the abuser. Punish them.
Exactly.
But I think to sort of like, and it's hard. And I'm not, you know, not to say like, oh no, just do this.
Yeah.
But I think the important thing to do is to also help the survivor know that like, when you're ready, I'm here and we can manage it. Yes. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's the most powerful thing you can do. I think it's like, I'm really unhappy with the situation. There's nothing wrong with saying like, I hate this for you.
Yes.
But I think to not isolate them and also to not punish them.
Exactly.
For something that's way more complicated.
Yeah. It's not just a binary like leave or stay kind of answer.
Absolutely. So I think it's very important to sort of be like, when you are ready, we'll go from there, and I'm here for that.
Exactly.
And it's hard.
Yeah.
But I think it's way more helpful.
And I think even like you mentioned dynamics, it's more tricky like if you've got children in the mix 100%. Because now it's not just, it's like where will my children go? And if like a social worker gets involved, my kids will get taken away, which then creates the system where it's like, I must actually stay for the survival of my kids. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's such an important point, because the other thing that I've learned with working with survivors is perpetrators are people. Yeah. Right? And people are complicated. Yeah. And I think we want to be like, there are villains all the time. Yeah. And, you know, as much as that is true. Yeah. There also can be really great dads. Exactly. Or really wonderful pastors. Exactly. Or really helpful teachers. Exactly. But they're just really bad partners, or they don't know how to manage anger. Yeah. So like for us to sort of assume that we can put that person in that little box. Yeah. Is not helpful, because the survivor or the partner is not experiencing them that way all the time. Exactly. Right? So I think to also be sensitive to like the complexities of the situation.
100%. I remember we were having a debate like, can you still be in love with your perpetrator? 100%. And that can happen. And again, it's because you go through waves, like somebody who's been your lover the whole time. In fact, I think I remember having this debate and saying like, I think what society does is like, once you find a partner, it's like you stop engaging with your bigger circle. So your partner becomes the focal point of your life. Yeah. And now when situations happen, you feel like this is the only person who knows and understands me. Because when last did I meet, I don't know, my best friend? Maybe we only see each other like once every 6 months.
There we go.
And then it's too complex of a situation to now go back and try and figure out what's going on in my networks.
100%. And I mean, I think the other thing is that, you know, GBV survivors are also people, which makes them complicated. They're not angelic victims.
Yeah,
and I think
the perfect gender-based violence survivor.
It's one of the most damaging stereotypes, because it says that some people deserve violence and other people don't, because like of who they are. Yeah. And nobody's perfect. And I think the other thing is with a partner like that is there's often that component of like, I know you better than anybody. Yeah. and you're not the nice person everybody thinks you are.
Exactly.
And people, survivors internalize that, and then now I've got to explain to my friend, and I don't want you to think badly of him, and it's complicated. So I think to be accessible and to be, the sort of way I like to say it, so the concept of like the Karen or the Karen.
Yes.
Is like to be the Karen in a survivor's life.
Yeah.
So like that's really helpful to have somebody who, if the survivor's like, the police haven't followed up with me.
Yes.
Then you'll be like,
Exactly.
cool. Or if they'll be like, I just don't know what to do. And it'll be like, well, let me look into it. So to be able to like, to be a bit of like the irritating one externally can be really helpful for a survivor so that they can focus on their recovery.
Yes.
And I think that's a way you can be helpful, is to harass the police.
Exactly.
or do those things, or like be able to mediate between family who don't understand what's going on now.
Yes.
Or say to friends and be like, she's going through something right now and she doesn't want to talk about it. So if we could just send her a nice message or something, like have that.
Like you, the filter, basically.
Yeah, have that approach as opposed to like, let's go to war, which I think is the impulse.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah.
But it's not helpful. Not always helpful.
Yeah. And because you've dealt with a lot of survivors, what advice do you have? Like if somebody is a survivor and they're grappling with now they have left, but it's building the confidence and the self, because a lot of survivors go through the journey and they realize like after the incident or through the process of becoming a new person, and they're like trying to identify who they are and rebuilding that confidence again.
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard, especially when it's within, when it's someone because I think a lot of your self-worth gets tied up into that. But I think the important thing is to be, I always will advocate for counseling, but I think if that's not for you, to find the thing for you that is like that can help you build yourself up and to see yourself as, and I'm hesitant to say like, see yourself as a survivor.
Yes, because not everyone wants to embrace,
And you're also the victim of a crime, right? And like, that's important.
Yeah.
That identity is important because you have access to justice. You deserve justice as a victim of a crime.
Yeah.
But I think what is always helpful is to sort of celebrate the wins, the little wins with yourself, but also to, know that post-traumatic growth is a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And recovery is possible. Because I think there's also this really toxic narrative around if you've been raped, your life is over now.
Yeah.
You'll never be the same again. You're broken. You're traumatized forever. You're never, like, if you hear the word rape, you're going to fall apart. And like, it's also really, really, really toxic because it sort of cinches people down to this like one identifying characteristic, and it's a weak one, right?
Yeah.
It's saying like you're now weak because of this thing forever. So I think to also sort of say to people like it's complicated. Like you can have good days.
Exactly.
You can, I had one survivor who she said in counseling, and she was making a joke. She was like, because when you go to the TCC, you often get a comfort pack.
Yes.
With like some items in it because you have to, give your clothing in for evidence and you aren't supposed to shower and whatever.
Yeah.
And then she was like, I didn't realize if you get raped, you get a prize. And I was like,
that's like,
and my face was, I didn't know like how to
deal with that.
But I love that moment because it happens a lot more than you think, because it's people, right?
Exactly.
And like, you manage it how you can. Like, sometimes you have a dark sense of humor about it. And so to tell survivors that there's no right way to recover. Yeah. That you need to find the thing for you and go from there. Yeah. I do think counseling is helpful, even if it's to talk about how it's affected you and not what happened. Because that's a rule, is that in counseling is like you never ask what happened. Yes. What are the details? Yeah. Because that's actually not the main focus of counseling. Counseling is a lot about how has it affected you? How has it impacted you?
It's like talking about the actual event, you relive the trauma again, and by the time you've gotten there, depending on like the reporting process, you've spoken to somebody when you went to the police station, or if you went to a TCC center, and so like to relive that story over and over and over again. And some survivors are so over it as well. By the time they get to you at counseling, they're like, okay, like
and it's almost like they become desensitized to the story sometimes.
Yeah.
But also other times it can be really traumatizing to talk about what happened. And that's not really the focus of counseling.
Exactly.
It's a lot about how it's affected you and how are you managing and how are you coping. And it's not about like the gory details always.
Yeah. And you do group counseling as well. So like if there's family members or the supporting. Yeah.
So Rape Crisis doesn't necessarily facilitate that, but there are some really amazing organizations that do so. FAMSA is one of them.
Yes.
And they do family counseling, and they do look at like trauma and things like that and family dynamics.
Yeah.
And there are situations like that where you need to mediate with the family a little bit, especially around adolescent survivors, because parents can also be really tricky. So to be able to sort of have a conversation with them about how they might not be being very helpful.
Exactly.
Which is difficult.
Yeah.
But it is important to get the support system on board.
Yeah.
And to try and say to them, like, you can have your breakdown in that room.
Exactly.
You know?
But don't expect your child to now have to,
But you can have that space, but it's just important that like you really try to remember that it's about them and it's about their journey.
That is so important. And you've now left Rape Crisis and you joined Kwanele. Can you tell us how's Kwanele revolutionizing the GBV space using tech?
Sure. So I I think I always volunteer at Rape Crisis because it's definitely an amazing organization, and the work that they do is incredible.
Yes.
And I do love the counseling side, but Kwanele it's in a similar field because of the GBV, but it's much broader. It's not just sexual violence, it's also gender-based violence more broadly and femicide, and working with survivors there.
Yeah.
But specifically in accessing justice.
Sure.
So, and making the criminal justice system a bit more accessible through the use of tech.
Yes.
So how Kwanele the main sort of feature of it was this app that they developed, and it's a data-free app and it's a free app.
That's
and
amazing.
It's basically like a panic button app. And there are quite a lot of those, but they're, you have to pay for them usually. And Kwanele sort of found a way to do that for free. And you activate the panic button, and then either SAPs or armed response are dispatched.
Yes.
But it also does an audiovisual recording.
Yes.
Which is great, because if you're in a situation, you can get, and that footage is timestamped, so it can
That's a made for court evidence.
So it's admissible in court, and it's also secured in a vault. So there's all sorts of, they've really tried to make it so that it is a way to collect evidence as well as get access to help.
That's amazing.
And then they also refer to organizations to provide direct services as well.
Yeah,
So,
which is quite helpful, because I think the whole system is very overwhelming for like a person who's not in the legal space or who doesn't understand the criminal justice
100%,
system.
yeah.
So to make it more accessible, because there's obviously also like language barriers, there's educational barriers to that, accessing that help. Yeah,
absolutely. And so that's the latest project that Kwanele is looking at now is. It's really exciting.
Yeah.
It's building a chatbot essentially using generative AI, artificial intelligence.
Yes.
And we're building a bot. We're calling it Chat GBV instead of Chat GPT, which I thought was very catchy. Because what it's going to do is and what we're building right now is that it's going to help people get information around reporting rape and getting a protection order.
Amazing.
But because generative AI in the broader sense, a lot of the data that it is trained to scrape is built for affluent white people in America or wherever. It's not always very accessible within the South African context. It doesn't have the language, it doesn't have the cultural sensitivities and nuances. So what Kwanele is doing is going into key communities and co-creating the language model and going to train the bot to be able to provide that information based on certain questions, based on the questions that the person asks. So in a language that is intended for so it's going to speak in a language intended for in the same language for the people it's intended to serve, which is really cool.
That's amazing, because then you personalize the experience and it's relatable to everyone. Like across races, across different languages. And then you get to, bridge those cultural differences in the way we express certain things.
And understanding as well, I think that there's not a right way to there's not like a perfect way to deal with it. There is space for cultural nuance in dealing with gender-based violence. What is also really exciting is like putting it in African languages and in vernacular and in language and legal language that then becomes easier to understand.
Exactly.
And also doesn't sort of, and I think especially in feminist spaces, as powerful as they can be, there's a lot of like, around sexual violence, around virginity.
Yes.
And it's like, your virginity is a construct. Like, you mustn't be sucking up on that. For a lot of people, that's very, very important.
Yeah.
So for the app to then, or the bot to say, like, don't, let me tell you about virginity as a concept, it's not helpful.
Exactly.
So that's also what it's starting to do. And we're also trying to work closely with sex workers.
Yes.
They have a very particular kind of experience with the police and accessing justice as well. And it's a weird, I think it can be a weird concept for people. It's like, why would I want to talk to a robot or a bot when like that's strange.
Yeah.
But what I learned through, being in the sector for a while is a lot of people start with Google now.
Yes, because that's where you go. You instinctively like, let me just Google it.
Or a WhatsApp line because they don't want to tell a person because it is complicated and they don't want to be judged. They don't want to be forced to report.
Exactly.
They don't know if it counts. They don't like. It's almost like they want to gather some intel first
and then make the next steps.
But then when you go to Google, it's not always regionally relevant.
Exactly, especially when it comes to like interdicts or like you could be having the wrong papers for the wrong court.
100%. So that's what's quite cool about this is that it's trying to almost be like a first point of call in accessing that information. And at any point, the person can opt to speak to a real human.
Yeah.
But we are the bot that we're creating it. And I think it's really important as well because AI is already being used for so much terrible stuff.
Yeah.
So I think to be able to bring this side of the conversation in is really, really important.
And I think it's nice because it centralizes the information. So like people now have like a point of call where they know like I need resources, I'm unclear about this. And it's not a space where you ask a question because you're talking to a bot that there's judgment or there's anything. You just get the information that you need.
Yeah. But it's and it sounds weird to say it's great fun to create because it is quite morbid, but I do think in this sector you have to have a bit of gallows humor because you'll burn out very quickly if you don't. But we had a staff meeting the other day where we were discussing like the persona of the bot.
Yes.
And like how should this bot what should they be? Like what kind of are they a person? Are they a robot?
Yeah.
Are they a woman or a man? Or are they gender neutral? So we had a back and forth about like, is the bot gender neutral? Like, and like discussing like, who would you want to approach? Like who, and a lot of the work we're doing, we're also surveying that and seeing like, who would you want to talk to if you are going to speak to the bot and how, and also to teach the bot then to respond in that persona.
Exactly.
And it's really exciting to be able to use technology in that way, I think, for this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because it is, a lot of this is going in that direction.
Yeah.
And that's really, it's important that we're in front of that and that we're using it
for a better cause.
Exactly.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So Ronel, it's our tradition on the podcast that when the guest is about to leave, that they leave like good parting words or advice for our community who are currently navigating the 20s. So do you have any advice that you could share with our community?
Sure. I think what I wish someone had told me when I was started in my 20s was that it's not that serious in the sense that like now is the time to learn about yourself and learn what you're interested in and learn what you want to do and who you are and all of those things. And like the more mistakes you do make there, it helps because you learn that that's not the path for you. So I think to sort of take that pressure off of yourself a little bit and realize like this is the time. Like I think the cool thing about like the product at the end of your 20s is not like you become a CA or a lawyer or a married person or with a child on the way or the perfect thing. Like the product at the end is a more nuanced you and a more understood you. Mm-hmm. So like whatever process that is, that's what you should look for. So to not be so, and I think to not be so hung up on the timelines, because especially with social media, I think we have there's so much pressure to be doing things at a certain pace. And it's not real, right? Like it's different for everybody. So I think to just be, to take your 20s as an experimental phase, I think, and then it can be quite fun. And I think it takes a lot of the pressure off as well. And I think for survivors, for rape or GBV survivors in their 20s, I think to also know that this is not a defining thing for you. This is not the rest of your life. Your life is not over now. I think that's really important because a lot of survivors within this age group. And so I think to also know that like it gets better. You're not always going to feel this way. That would be my advice.
And that's it for our 7th episode. Thank you for being a part of this growing community. And if this conversation has touched you or helped you in any way, consider sharing it with a friend, colleague, or even a family member. Remember, you can also support the show by subscribing to the podcast and giving us a rating on your podcast platform or on our YouTube channel. If you're looking for a place to debrief about episode 7 with Ronel, follow our social media pages, Navigating the 20s, on LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook. Remember that the next LinkedIn and Substack newsletter will be out today, which is the 22nd of November. This has been Navigating the 20s. We will be back with more in 2 weeks' time on the 6th of December.